let's just take a step back for a second, right? So now, for all the anti-Israel activists, one of the things that they love to do is cite the United Nations. The United Nations, the Commission of Inquiry, the United Nations resolutions. What did Amnesty International say? What did blah, 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 right? Now, some of these same activists will point to the fact that the United Nations had a hand in doing Africa dirty, right? In this case, Patrice Lumumba, right? The late Kofi Annan's case, General Secretary of the United Nations, again, not a Zionist, but he even called out the fact at times that the United Nations seem to be strangely silent on other issues, especially pertaining to Africa.
November 2006, the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan criticized the UN Human Rights Council. Since the beginning of their work, they have focused almost entirely on Israel, and there are other crisis situations like Sudan, where they have not been able to say a word.
We'll say a word, and whenever we come together, you guys want to pass another resolution against Israel. What is this? Again, not a Zionist, but he's like, okay, but he's an African, and he's like, okay, what is this? Like, why can't we also address these things? Like, all of these things get shoved under the table. If we can just start to connect some of those dots, we can see that, okay, is this same United Nations that's been screwing Africa over, that's been covering up slavery in Africa, right? That's been covering for, I mean, I want to say slavery, I'm talking about covering for the Arab slave trade, Arabs trading, buying and selling African men, women, and children in slavery, right? The UN covering up for these Islamist groups all over the country, all over the continent, many of whom are backed by the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? The UN never speaks about that, strangely silent about the atrocities that plague Africa, yet very, very narrowly focused on Israel. Now, if you are not an Israeli, if you're not a Zionist, you're just an African looking at this, that is a kind of like, okay, look, I'm not even saying, I'm Israel high. I'm just looking at this going, why don't you ever talk about my issues? Why don't you ever talk about my problems? Why are we always talking about this one country? Why we always focus on this? What about the rest of the world? I mean, right? The world's a huge place. It's a tiny little country over here. Why are we so focused on that? And we haven't even had a discussion. The word Africa didn't come out of your mouth for the last 3 months. Like, how come we can't talk about this? And if we can just start to connect those dots, we can say, okay, does this same United Nations that keeps screwing Africa over, are they really reliable when it comes to what's going on in the Middle East? We can see clearly they have an agenda. And if it's true that the United Nations had a hand in the assassination of an African prime minister because they didn't like its agenda, then maybe it's true that this same United Nations might be lying to us about other things. Maybe there is something fishy about the fact that this same United Nations is so disproportionately focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict.